Thank you for joining me, Mark and Ben. I was telling you a little bit beforehand that I'm obsessed with your work on active inference and social media, particularly, but also just tech, cognition, interrelationships. So I wondered, maybe to start off, would you like to say something about that, about your collaboration and about your work? Maybe just to introduce people.
Oh, that's nice, Ben. Why don't you take a crack first? Because we've got a few things. We've got a few things like this now. Actually, you and I.
Yep.
Yeah, it's been an ongoing collaboration with Mark and myself, which has been fantastic. I think one of the reasons for that is me and Mark work so well together.
So well, you're one of my favorite collaborators. You and Julian Kiverstein. I love collaborating with you guys.
Things happen very easily and kind of organically, and the writing is very fluid, which is not that common. But it started, Mark was actually my master's degree supervisor back at Edinburgh in 2018, 2019. And at the time, I'd not been exposed to active inference, predictive processing, or the free energy principle when I started that degree. It wasn't until Mark happened to give a seminar at Edinburgh on the topic of the free energy principle and predictive processing that I was exposed to those frameworks. And so that was definitely a kind of...
And is your background in philosophy, Ben, as well?
It is, yeah. So my undergraduate degree was here at Sussex, actually, and it was philosophy and English literature. And so originally I was interested in aesthetics, fiction, imagination, all of that kind of stuff. And then I kind of found myself, it was a very gradual drift over towards philosophy mind, cognitive science. And I was fortunate enough to meet one or two people completely by chance along the way that had kind of ongoing influence on me. And that culminated with me applying to Edinburgh, to their philosophy of cognitive science program. And that's where I've been ever since. So I feel like I've kind of found my home, and coming into contact with predictive processing and active inference was definitely kind of a big part of that, because maybe we can talk about this later, but there are certain things about those frameworks that kind of made me think, this is where I need to be. This is how I'm going to address these questions in the way that I want to address them. But my thesis was on social media. I knew I wanted to work on technology, and Mark supervised that thesis. And I think we realized that we just tended to think about these things in the same ways, and that we worked well together. And so we never stopped working together.
I'm glad you did as well, because it's been very beneficial for myself anyway, reading them. I'm going to include the papers and the link for people, because I think they're very accessible. That was something I really found about your work, Mark, as well, as an introduction to active inference and predictive processing, that it's really, you're one of the best onboarders, I think, to that sometimes very complicated landscape of ideas. And so I've found your work really beneficial in terms of actually getting into it. And I know you were a student of John Vervaeke's, I believe.
Yeah, actually, the first one that's relevant is Andy Clark, because I was, I did my master's PhD and first postdoc with Andy, and I was in a postdoc with Andy when I was teaching Ben, and then Ben won a place as Andy's doctoral student as well, and Andy only takes one doctoral student a year, so it's an honor, and Andy's amazing. And I mean, anything that I do well, I sort of upward attribute to Andy. I mean, Andy is the most accessible, coolest, philosopher of cognitive science in the world. And working with him for almost 10 years leaves its mark, I think, because he aims a lot for clarity and accuracy. Yeah, so that was good. But yeah, I'm working with John right now. I'm at the University of Toronto part-time. And I'm managing his lab, the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies lab. So we're collaborating on all sorts of stuff. I think have you read our relevance paper, predictive processing and relevance?
I have, yeah, definitely. Yeah. I had John on last week, actually. We were doing conversation.
Cool.
I had a couple of conversations with John, and we kind of ongoing stuff around.
He's lovely, hey? Isn't he such a nice person to interview?
He's the best, man.
Yeah, he's just a legitimately good human being. I mean, and brilliant at what he does.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it'll probably come into this conversation as well, because it's, it's relevant to these topics. But I suppose to start, maybe in terms of active inference, like, why do you think this is the framework for these tech problems? I mean, that your work, it's something I happen to agree with, but like, what is it about it that you think captures the kind of social media problem?
Yeah, it's good. Can I take a first crack, Ben?
Relating to cognition.
You follow up. Huh?
I can have a go.
No. I want to go first. Let me go first.
You go first. Sorry.
I'll give you
plenty of time.
I'll give you. Here's what I think. This is the first reason why I think it's relevant. One of the things that I find very very inspiring about thinking of cognitive systems in this anticipatory way is that when you get this shift from thinking, oh well, the world is out there and the nervous system and brain are busy, trying to interpret that world. When you make that shift from that to primarily thinking the brain and the nervous system is taking everything it knows about how the world works and how cause and effect flow, and then it's generating for itself its best estimation about what's happening given what it knows and the evidence. That shift is not only interesting for the science because it solves a bunch of problems, I think, and it helps us overcome some puzzles that we've struggled with in perception research for a long time. But I think it's also very inspiring for the way that we live, and I think it's directly relevant for for the problems that we're having with technology, because it means that the world you live in is being constructed by your beliefs, by the things you believe. So it's no longer the case that you're just like a person who has some beliefs. Like, oh, who cares what I'm looking at for 8 hours a day? They're just beliefs. Like, so what? Like, no, I'm a whole human. The world is out there. It's not gonna do anything there. Like, so what if I have bad belief hygiene where I'm getting inundated with like weird evidence? Why? Like, who cares? And this flips side to say, like, no, you should care. This is your reality. Like, the reality you live in, the world you experience, and the way that you experience yourself literally is constituted by the things that you believe. And if you're on a training regimen where your beliefs are subtly drifting, either in more extreme ways or pathological ways or just unskillful, unhelpful ways, you are slowly drifting into a pathological, unskillful, unhelpful experience of life. So, I mean, like that, if you're only catching this now, like, go and read the paper so you really get this, because this isn't only relevant for scientists. I think everybody's got to come into contact with this. Your reality is built from what you believe. That means you have to be really careful about the people you spend time with, what you believe. And algorithms don't care about giving you good beliefs. They care about giving you the beliefs that get you hot and bothered, so you keep coming back.
Yes, I was going to say that there's an entire system around manipulating your beliefs to keep you engaged for the profit of companies. And the more time we spend in the digital landscape with those incentives, I know you, from the paper, you have this idea that social media is like a bad evidence generator. The kind of crowbars are
Nice.
generative model from reality. And, the more time we spend potentially in the digital world, the more disconnected we could get from reality, and that there's affective and, there's so many consequences for that in terms of our own experience of life. I don't want to go too far away, Ben. If you want to even jump in on that one, and then maybe this bad evidence generator, we can start from there.
Yeah, so I would certainly just kind of reemphasize what Mark said. I think what you get from predictive processing and active inference is this shift towards something quite profound, which is the notion that what you experience as a subject is, it's not the world. It's, you have a generative model that is constituted by sets of expectations, priors, and precision weightings, which is essentially the kind of, in case anybody watching is not familiar, it's a kind of inference about how reliable certain streams of information are or how relevant they are. And so what you experience in a subjective way is that model. Essentially, you experience the world is kind of constituted by your expectations. And so right out of the gate, I think once you adopt this view, it motivates a kind of new, deeper concern about things like social media, because the things that you're taking on, the evidence generators that you're exposed to, really matter in a much deeper way. And I think it also shifts us towards maybe even a more understanding and compassionate view, which is when we see people that are struggling with exposure to certain things, it gives us a kind of a slightly more striking substantive picture of what's going on there. It's not the case that we're just influenced by things that we see. Actually, when the conditions are right or wrong, that can then come to constitute the way that we experience the world and other people in really profound ways.
So if you think about conspiracy theories and you think just how could somebody be on board with that? This is part of the answer, is that, just like Ben said, you get the constituent features to be right. And then that is the most relevant reality. I mean, they're defending what they take to be real. And that's how powerful this adjustment can be. It's not just biasing, but constituting.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dan.
And that those beliefs aren't just like a propositional kind of like, oh, I like these things. Like they're very much embodied, and it is your reality in a very experiential sense of like, you know, it's distorting the way. I thought it was very interesting, the example you give in the paper of the Snapchat surgery, like body dysmorphia, whereby people are actually, it's a way of trying to bring together your online self and your offline self, so you're not registering such a prediction error. Because that seems like almost an absurd thing that you'd like trot out and be like, oh, look, these people doing weird stuff. And you're like, well, actually, it turns out that's actually a significant way of trying to cope with this transformation that's happened that people are just thrown into.
Yeah, I think it's another important thing. I mean, people outside of the predictive processing world have talked about this. There's a book by Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber called The Enigma of Reason that talks about the way that our beliefs are. We take it for granted that our beliefs are just there to be truth tracking in some really idealized way. But actually, our beliefs are the whole process of minimizing prediction error and maintaining this kind of optimal grip on your world is sometimes less about truth tracking and more about just coping in certain ways. So, you know, like the most optimal model is not always going to be the most truth tracking model, which is something else that comes out of predictive processing. But another thing as well is, I mean, one thing that seems really unique to these frameworks is work. So I kind of came into PP through 4E cognitive science, which has this emphasis on embodiment and extension, and embeddedness within an environment. And I think there's a sense in which there's an irony in the recent history of cognitive science in that all of these frameworks and approaches were kind of pushing outwards the boundaries. So it was trying to get beyond the brain in a way and into the significance of how we act on the world, and how the way that we think and feel is kind of deeply constituted and influenced and scaffolded by external things. But there was a kind of emptiness at the core of this, which was that there was, and this is something Andy has said, which is there was never really any kind of cohesive theory of brain function at the center of this. So we had this pushing outwards, but there was nothing, there's no account of what was going on the inside. And that's what active inference has given us. So now we have this very complete picture, because active inference is this theory of brain function that has these formalisms and this quite sophisticated mathematical side, but it can also accommodate these other insights from embodied cognitive science. And so what you end up with is, if you tell the story in a very comprehensive way, you end up with a very multi-layered notion of what an agent in the world is. So you can move from neurobiology, computation, through to like the importance of interoception and physiology and embodiment in this very raw, very visceral way, plus the significance of action, which is, you know, a core part of active inference. And Andy's work as well has shown how all of this accommodates, not just accommodates, but actually kind of really makes sense of and augments ideas about the extended mind and embedded cognition, distributed cognition. So it just kind of brings everything together in a really nice way. And you end up, and this is something I really like about Mark's work on addiction, is that you end up with this kind of agent environment system account of a phenomenon.
It was exactly what I was thinking there, is
just an account of like what's going on in the dopamine or what's happening outside. Like it actually connects all of these things in a really nice way.
And it seems essential for social media as well, because the digital environment is an environment that we're in. And for me, a lot of the attention economy literature was very much missing this kind of framework of environment agent dynamics. Like they might have had kind of a thin account of the agent, but then there was a sense that it was just this perceptual thing going on. It's like, no, you're actually embedded in a digital environment, like an extended cognition kind of perspective of like your brain is taking these things as real. Like, you know, there isn't a huge difference between the experiences online, the experiences
It's one of the
offline.
things I really like about Yele's work on this is this kind of shift from seeing the problem as just an abundance of information. So the mind is just this kind of passive.
It's literally what I'm writing about at the moment.
Taking in information, where Yele uses active inference to say, no, look, it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's about the affordances and the kind of the opportunities to act that these digital affordances are giving us. I think he articulates that really nicely with active inference.
And it's a massive change, really, in the literature, because the attention economy literature is based on that filter model of attention, the kind of Broad-Bentian paradigm of this like serial processing of just information coming in and then action being taken after that. Whereas whenever the Yele reverses it in terms of active inference, you get a very different picture, really, of why people would be so immersed in this. And then you get like the social competition dynamics of like, you know, like getting metrics for popularity and how important you are, and social competition for attention. And you almost get another feedback loop that keeps people involved beyond just the like Skinner box aspect of like rewards for this and that. So that's my framing of. Yeah, sorry, maybe I'm going too quickly there, but
no, that's good. That's good. I just wanted to put a tail on that. I mean, we've been talking about the way that social media can harmfully bend your model of how the world works. And you just touched on such an important part there. One of the places that it can bend us is it can bend your expectations for the kinds of rewards you're expecting in a particular niche, which is really turns out to be very vicious. So, you know, we're set up to track and especially feel good when things are working in a certain way. We have a story about that. But I mean, we all know that, right? Like when you eat and you drink and when we sex, when we, you know, these are things that we just have hardwired rewards for. And we have created these synthetic digital replacements for a lot of these things. So you're getting cued that you're getting this huge amount of social credit, which feels incredible for the system that's attempting to produce high social credit. But two things happen quick. One, it's empty social credit. I like saying this to my students. How many? I first of all, I make the game. Who has the most followers and likes in the room? We sort of suss it out till somebody says, you know, I've got 1 million. Like I've got a super cute cat, so I've got like 1 million. And then you say, how many people on that list are coming when you're in hospice to help change your diaper, to feed you? How many on that list? How many on that list when you come to end of life are coming to be with you? Because it's a really good way to think of how many good friends you have. How many friends are going to show up when it gets messy and ugly? And the dangerous thing here is that we evolved this sensitivity for social credit so that we were motivated to create networks and dynamics of support systems and so that we can reduce this volatility, this entropy together as a community. I mean, that's the whole thing. One of the great things about humans is we're like Voltron. We can combine to become better at managing uncertainty. We're better together, you know, and that's what this is. It's been completely hijacked because you can give you the sense that it's working when in fact it's completely hollow. It's just like heroin in a way, because heroin makes the brain feel like everything you've ever wanted, you're doing better than expected at getting it now, except for actually the opposite's happening is you're actually trending away from a good grip rather than towards a good grip. So nasty, actually. And we think it's so innocuous, but it isn't. It's got a really nasty side effect. And once you have those expectations set, anything less than that burns us. So like once you get onto heroin is the amount of error that you can reduce, then the brain is like, well, heroin's the only thing I want to do because nothing else satisfies like that anymore because I have expectations that that's how good we can feel. Same thing with social credit. You feel like, oh, now anything less than 10,000 likes and I don't like that picture and I don't like myself in that picture, you know, or I don't like myself at all because my online filtered image gets all this attention and my real life image doesn't, like who I actually am doesn't. So I don't like myself anymore because there's the social credit I'm used to now. You're continually chasing the dragon.
Yeah. And that it's leapt over the physical world in a sense. I really think since COVID, my perception was that the digital world started to become more important for a lot of people, even for news and as this kind of portal into reality. as more people got status and fame through social media, and that became like the media outlets have to be on social media, the institutions have to be on social media, the police, the guards in Ireland actually have to have a ministry of social media, basically, where they have to correct in real time the stories that are coming out to be like, no, this isn't true, this isn't happening, or this is like,
wow.
So I think, so many of those dynamics now have become culture, really. I mean, talking about distributed cognition, like the digital started out as a fun toy thing, but I think they're really powering a lot of our international culture.
Yeah, I think digital technology is interesting in so many different ways, but I think just to take a step back, I think one of the things that is so dangerous, also, I always want to say potentially dangerous. I mean, lots of people I know engage with social media in completely non-problematic ways, and it's so the claim here. I always feel I always feel like I need to be careful and say, the claim is not that social media is like evil. It's always deadly in these ways. I think the real key for this work is to try and identify like the kinds of contexts and factors that can make it disrupt our dynamic with the world in these ways that can be suboptimal or harmful. But it's technology in general, I think, one of the things that it's done is imbued us with this incredible capacity to take these rewards that occur naturally in the world and then abstract them and manufacture them in ways that kind of accentuates and kind of blows up their rewarding qualities in ways that can really warp our relationship with the world. So there's a book called Supernormal Stimulus, where there's an experiment. I forget who did the experiment, but it's basically what they did was they took a certain species of bird that lays eggs with a particular pattern on, and the researchers made fake eggs where the pattern had been kind of made more colorful and brighter and bigger. And they put the fake eggs into the environment with some parent birds, and the parent birds actually abandoned their own eggs to sit on the fake eggs. And this seems to be something that we're really good at replicating in our world with things like sugary junk food, with the kind of social interactions that you get on social media, with internet pornography. I think is a slightly controversial example, but I think it does fit this kind of schematic there, where the affordances of the technology allow us to kind of ostensibly access more of a reward, but it's in the abstraction that we lose something, which is what Mark was talking about there. I think there's always a nourishing side to these rewards that I think gets lost in the abstracting, which is really easy to forget. And the affordances of digital technology in particular, I think, are really good at doing this. So.
Yeah, and that it's kind of baked into the mechanics of the platforms in some sense. So I think people don't notice it necessarily while they're operating. Like Mark, you mentioned uploading a photo. You think, I'm uploading this photo because I like it or something. Maybe then you're kind of thinking, oh, what will people think of it? And then you're thinking about other things you've posted. And so there's a lot of tailoring to like the game mechanics of the environment that goes on. And I suppose that does, one question I wanted to ask you is like, do you think social media is reformable, like in a sense that you could remove some of the persuasive design elements, maybe some of the gamification, and have a healthier version of it? Or do you think it's just doomed?
I mean, it seems like it's possible, yeah, but I don't know if we would be attracted to. We won't be attracted to it in the same way. So
no money in it, but
yeah, like you wouldn't scroll for 8 hours something that wasn't high sugar, high fat in these sorts of ways. Probably, you would come there and you would, satisfy whatever that tool was meant for, and then you would return once again to your, semi-bumpy, commonly socially awkward human existence, which is actually beautiful. I mean, you don't want to miss your socially awkward, slightly weird, bumpy human existence in favor of something polished, and because this is actually what it is to be a human, is to be socially awkward a little bit and to work through those things and to figure each other out. And there's another of those nasty loops. Strange loops are everywhere in this framework. Everything seems like it eats itself once it gets going. But there's another one. The more time that we spend online because it feels good, and ordinary human interaction can be a bit bumpy and a bit awkward. So it's smoother and cooler. Like real life sex can be bumpy and awkward. Online sex is smooth and polished. Of course, it's not your sex online, so that's significant.
Yep.
And but the more time you're in the polished realm, the less time you're actually developing the skills to navigate the bumpy, awkward, but very real human experience. And so the less capable you are at it, which means the more likely you are to go back online, and which deviates from the time that you need to actually get better at being a human. I mean, and once you're in, I mean, to get out again, I guess I wouldn't be surprised that we find in the research, I haven't seen any of this yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's already out there. I mean, I guess it's probably already out there. But, they talk today about different drugs of addiction actually have a natural shelf life for most people. Like there are like a certain number of years per drug. Basically, anybody who gets bad into that drug ends up popping out the other side after a certain amount of time. I suspect, I haven't done research on this yet, but I suspect what's happening there is that's about the amount of time that you get, that you're in a drug before your brain gets enough counter evidence for the way that it's communicating that things are going well. So like heroin says, no, things are going really well. And you need about 10 years of counter evidence and like the harmful effects of a 10-year addiction before you're like, oh no, that's just a feeling. Actually, nothing's getting better. It's all getting worse. I wonder if we won't do the same thing with social media where we get a natural eviction. We just aren't at that horizon yet, because we're on there. You do it long enough, then you realize, you look around and go like, wait, but I don't have a family. I don't have a family or friends or anybody who cares about me. So, I mean, you have to pop back out eventually.
Yeah, there are always other competing tendencies in life, especially, I mean, I think people who become badly addicted to drugs I think those are in some ways very egregious cases. And I think that you have cases of drug and alcohol addiction where the dynamics really break down badly. But I think for most people who struggle with their online life and their social media interactions, I think typically there are going to be competing tendencies there, like the desire for good relationships, the desire for good friendships, the desire to kind of go and see the world and travel and things. So I think this is why I think it's the dynamics and the underlying kind of like the underlying foundations there are the same. I don't think there's any difference in kind between social media addiction and heroin addiction. I think it's just
important observation as well.
Yeah,
different.
It's a difference in kind of how badly things have gone wrong, and obviously there are reasons for that. But in terms of kind of, there's no reason. I don't think there's any principled reason that we can't imagine social media platforms. In fact, I think it's quite easy to imagine social media platforms where you kind of strip out some of these more sticky, more potentially problematic features. I think it's quite easy to look at social media and say what's wrong with it, and lots of people have been doing that. However, I agree with Mark in that there's a kind of economic side to this. You have to think about what kinds of incentives are in play and what kind of business models make sense for people that make social media. But also there's a kind of more fundamental issue, which is, I heard it said recently, this was said by Axel Constant, who is a active inference researcher. So credit to Axel for this, but he said that there's something law-like about uncertainty. It's kind of like gravity, in that any system that is a living system kind of has to minimize uncertainty. It's always kind of moving down a gradient of uncertainty towards certainty. And so if you think about it in that way, there's what we've done in designing digital technology is kind of create this portal for uncertainty minimization, for potentially doing much better than expected at minimizing uncertainty. And so the question is, are we capable of...
you froze there for a second, Ben. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You froze after saying the slope of uncertainty minimizing.
Oh, okay. So there's something. So for any system that's a living system, there's this kind of law-like nature of a gradient from uncertainty to certainty. And so in the environment, we tend to find different strategies and different ways of minimizing uncertainty. We have different action policies. And in designing social media, I think what we've done is kind of open up this portal to very, very steep gradients of uncertainty minimization kind of within the context of our social lives. And so I'm interested to think about the possibilities for, like, what motivations would we have really for moving away from that. These things are so stimulating and so arousing, and can also be portals to very steep gradients of uncertainty minimization in a good way as well. So it's not all bad here. So it's how do you separate out the good from the bad in terms of how effective they are at minimizing uncertainty. So I think in principle it's a very easy question. We can just imagine, we can engage our radical imagination and say, oh well, we remove the gamification, we ban the filters, we do this, we do that. But actually I think in practice I'd be quite skeptical of these platforms flourishing, for a variety of reasons. I don't think we'd be as drawn to use them, and I think companies would be less inclined, less incentivized to build them as well.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think the business model, which is a lot of what my work is on, basically denies that. Like it's impossible for them really to capture that much attention without having a lot of these features. And if one of them does it, if TikTok optimizes for more and more short form video, YouTube has to do it and Instagram has to do it because that's capturing more attention. So you end up with this kind of race for whoever figures out the new thing. Everybody has to do it. And I think in that sense, from within the companies, reform is very, very unlikely that they do it themselves. I think it has to be some sort of regulatory, like public health, like this is, it's like smoking again, basically, of being like, these behavioral addictions are causing destruction to individuals. Our culture is becoming addicted, and it's actually very hard to, plan for the future and do things with all the stuff going on. And it'll have to be, then the problem is it's an international problem. So which government, does it and that stuff. But I think you could imagine like a better one down the line. But
part of this complexity is what leads me back to thinking the solution. I mean, I'm happy people are working at that sort of solving it out there set, which I guess is needed. But I really think part of the solution is going to have to be you solve it in here. I think with these sort of twin factors of we don't have good skilled attention abilities. These can be trained. There are training regimens that are really good at increasing your metacognition, your controllability of attention. Also, there are like techniques and trainings and skills that you can generate that allow you to access and get more from rewards that are available in your environment. And then the third one is, starting to take bites out of this meaning crisis we're in, because one of the reasons we are fascinated by these better than expected gradients is because in our life, given the kind of belief networks that we have and the kind of niches we're embedded in, we are up against tons of volatility. So we're turning to this to get relief. We're not necessarily turning to this because it's great. We're turning to it because it's better than the thing we're going through. And there are ways of changing your relationship. Sorry, tell me.
Better than the void of meaning that people are finding, and that flow you talk about, like the bad bootstraps, like flow from video games, flow from social media, can feel better than a complete absence of it.
Completely. But then maybe the thing to do isn't more regulation. Although I don't want to say that. I'm happy people are on that. But for me, the place that I feel positioned is thinking more about how do we change ourselves and how do we change our microcultures so that we can be extracting more rewards, so that we can have better control of our attention, so that we can have more meaning. And ideally you would leave these things as a side effect rather than trying to prevent the addictive behavior, fill it in. I mean, we have this from rat experiments. I think everybody knows, right? So do you know the rat experiment, man? Do you know this?
Oh, like getting them addicted to cocaine and
the rat city.
But good friends and
as soon as
living a good life.
Exactly. As soon as you put them in the rat park where they have friends and complexity, then they don't go to the drugs anymore because they can satisfy their reduction of uncertainty, all sorts of meaningful and interesting ways. So they don't need to do it synthetically anymore. One of the reasons we might be going to synthetic is because we're not learning the skills to have a meaningful life. Those are skills. Like there's the good news of the podcast, right? I mean, there are actually skills you can develop that make you better at this.
I think niche construction was mentioned there. I think that's really key. I think oftentimes in predictive processing, you'll hear people say things like, "Oh, there are two ways to reduce uncertainty. There's update your model or act on the world. But there's kind of a third way, which is one of the things I like about predictive processing is it does kind of bring together the inner and the outer. And I think that one thing that we know is really effective is to alter your environment in some way such that you scaffold kind of effective competing tendencies. So if you think about your engagement, I've done some work on this with Inés Hipólito, where we kind of bring in some of the concepts from dynamical systems theory, such as like attractor basins, and you think about yourself as like a kind of agent going through life along a trajectory, and your social media use is kind of getting out of control. You're maybe using it more than you wanted to. You think of that as a kind of basin that with these steep sides that you've been kind of sucked into. And conceptually, one thing I really like about this is you can imagine kind of the remedy to that to just be to flatten those kind of like the sides of that attractor basin. And some ways you can do that is, I think, like Mark said, I mean, you can focus on your outside social life. You can focus on building different kinds of connections, like creative hobbies and outlets and all kinds of things. Really, you're not at all powerless. So I think the part of the solution is in cultivating competing tendencies, in terms of like the whole network of the things that you're doing. You can flatten the steepness of that basin that way. But also, it should be said, like the inner aspect of this is not unique to predictive processing. So it should be said that a lot of people writing on this topic have taken slightly different angles toward the same solution. So Shannon Valler, for example, has taken a kind of virtue ethics approach, a kind of Aristotelian. She talks about techno-moral virtues and what kinds of character traits should we aim towards cultivating. And of course, all of this can be kind of integrated with the active inference story as well. And there's others as well that have said similar things.
And man, just
it's
for you,
cool
just going forward, Ben, you said the third one is environmental scaffolding, which is so good, but I would say that was the fourth one, right? The third one is redeployment of precision. So you have update your model, act on the world, just change your precision patterns, which is attention control, right? So, I mean, I love that. I mean, nobody's written that yet, that 4-way. I think maybe we should do that, because that's like model update and acting on the world.
Pretty good paper, all right.
Changing the world and changing the way you deploy precision sort of is a nice 4 axes.
Well, I think niche construction might kind of I'd be interested in how it compares formally to just like bog standard active inference, just kind of action perception loops. But I mean, taking into account the ways that you are fairly empowered in terms of how you structure your environment most of the time, even down to very simple things, like leaving your phone in another room when you go to bed, setting reminders for certain things. You can offload a fair amount of cognitive labor into the environment.
Definitely. And I think that kind of external restructuring your environment I've gotten very into the kind of deep hostile scaffolding idea that there's that they've that there's this, like gambling technologies, I suppose there's certain online spaces that are set up.
This is David Spurrett's work, I think. On
is it Tim and Spur, not sure, but and that kind of I mean, because I think the meaning crisis framing for me, I talked to Vervaeke about it before as well, actually, in terms of this, like, you hear Mark Zuckerberg interviewed about Facebook, and he said he wanted to connect people, and it was this idea that it was about connection. Nobody's connected anymore, so we're going to build these things to connect people. And there's a real narrative behind a lot of the structure of these things. Like, they're very dramatic, and they plug you into a story, I think, that makes sense of your life in terms of your status, your relationships to other people, who you are in the digital world, what your brand is. And I think it's filling a narrative void that we have in our lives, in just this current meaning crisis society, that this is a substitute for people to understand themselves, to organize their attention and their experience. And so even just getting rid of social media, I feel like we'd invent something else, like, that would be just as bad. Like, because addictions, I think, are those pseudo kind of they give you something to focus on, but it's ultimately, fruitless. But I wonder, do you see something then filling that void? Because I think that's what we're talking about in kind of this structuring of the environment. Like, we need something else,
Yeah, wisdom.
Yeah, an institute, wisdom, spiritual
we need
traditions.
we need to be phrenomos. We need to be wise. I think we need to be wise people. I'm with John on that. I mean, the meaning crisis is vicious because, I mean, it's complicated, but the conditions that we find ourselves in have removed from us some of the ready-to-hand abilities that we used to have for dealing with existential terror. And now we are being regularly inundated with volatility that we don't know how to digest. And so then places that we can go where we get the sense that we're gripping, where we get a feeling like we're making it work, those become massively illuminated for us. I mean, it's really not a surprise that some people are addicted. It's a surprise that we're not all addicted. Maybe we are. Maybe that is something that we're experiencing now, because there are huge percentages of the population now that are hooked on social media in a what we might typify as a pathological way. Spending 8 or 9 hours a day is a lot. They are alluring because we have lost some of the skills that we need to deal with the volatility, and at the same time, we have massive upticks in volatility. Shannon Valor says you have this exponential increase in uncertainty with AI-based technologies. So we have this massive burst of uncertainty, and at the same time, we have a loss of our ability as humans to manage and digest and meet volatility. Put those two things together, and we're adrift. So anything that gives you a sense today that you are not adrift, I mean, it becomes totally, I think it's completely a normal thing that we would reach out and find it there. So I think, man, you're exactly right. As long as those are the conditions, then we will keep finding and creating and leveraging opportunities to feel better, even if we're not getting better. So I think, the big solution here is that we start maybe taking some bites out of what we think of as the basis for the meaning crisis, which for me, and then I wasn't really expecting you to talk about this on the podcast, but I really think it is wisdom. Like, making, I think Shannon Valor's right. I think if we were to turn towards thinking about what do I want to be as a human, and if that's scaffolded around virtue, and you set that at the center of your life, and you start developing some of the skills that requires, things like tolerance to uncertainty, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, being cool with failure, loving being awkward and socially weird, giving a shit about other people, serving your community. You put those at the heart, these things start falling away spontaneously because they are antithetical. A lot of these are antithetical to that primary work. So I think it might be ultimately it might be a goal issue, that if we could change the way that we're thinking about the kinds of things that we want to be, maybe that starts already softening some of these edges. Then we could maybe possibly use it. We could use it without being hooked by it, because we're not so adrift that it's so alluring.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's interesting to think about addiction, kind of drug and alcohol addiction, as a kind of. I think a lot of addicts who get sober from substances, I think they experience a kind of localized meaning crisis, a kind of very acute meaning crisis, where it's not just that the drugs or the alcohol were kind of chemically nourishing, but actually they're nourishing in the sense that they provide an identity, and they provide a kind of playbook for, like, oh, this is what I do in social situations. I get really drunk and chaos ensues, and I'm gregarious and I don't really care about anything, and it's nourishing in a very deep way. It gives you a kind of expectation about who you are as a person and how you're going to act. And when you get sober and that's dragged away from you, part of the crisis there is there's not just a chemical withdrawal, but there's kind of like a meaning withdrawal as well. Which is,
if I don't go to the bar, what do I do on a Friday night? If all my, what am I going to do? Play soccer? Like that's, and you can feel like that coming out of long-term addiction. Like, what am I going to do? Like, be a sport guy now? I mean,
and part of the problem there is recognizing that the path back from that is slow. And it comes back to the supernormal stimulus stuff, which is I think there's an interesting distinction here between fast and slow, which is it's part of what needs to be cultivated. And I'm no expert on wisdom or these kinds of practices at all, but it seems to me that what we're trying to cultivate here is a kind of the competing tendencies that I was talking about. The ones that are worth cultivating are ones that have to be cultivated over time and with care and with some ups and downs and stepping away from the expected. I mean, a lot of the work Mark's done on aerodynamics is about kind of tuning our expectations for prediction error minimization. And I think internalizing what's going on with aerodynamics can be really helpful, because it's realizing that actually your expectations can shift over time. Okay, so the model that you have of the world that says, like, if things aren't going fabulously well for me all the time, then I'm going to feel really bad and frustrated. Like, that's a temporary state of being. That's not a necessary feature of human experience. And so I think part of the work is tuning those expectations to understand that the things that can be more nourishing, like real world social connections and relationships and creative practices and things like that, they simply don't offer these like very steep gradients of prediction error minimization that some other things offer, and that's okay.
Yeah, nice.
And it might even be better for your long-term self.
Well, for sure. Yeah.
think about getting off sugar. Sugar's cueing to the body, refined sugar's cueing to the body, like, wow, you're really killing it. In a world where there are limited resources, that's what the biosystem thinks. Like, you're doing great. Like, McDonald's is you're hitting all the buttons. And to come off of that requires that you do a couple of things. First of all, you have to tolerate the uncertainty that eating vegetables has less gradient to it. But if you take the time and readjust your palate, because we've ruined our palate, it's like we've ruined our predictive palate. If you give it enough time, the palate will adjust, because we're flexible systems, and then you are back getting good gradients from actually healthy food. That I remember when I first became a vegetarian, I did it for health reasons. It took about 3 months maybe for my palate to sort of update, and then I loved it, and then I really loved it, and then the more subtle things that were available to me were delicious and wonderful. But it took the time to actually you're snowblind when you make a transition like that. You have to hang around until the predictive system updates.
Like destroying your fixed point attractors, and then you end up with an increase in uncertainty, and then eventually you actually get a better model because of it. Like, I know that you talk about well-being, and that's the model really of like the difference between like psychopathology and well-being is the ability to do that, to go through that kind of process.
Nice, dig it.
And I think maybe just like, I suppose, to go into some wild speculation, in terms of, do you think there's tech solutions to the meaning crisis? Because I know this kind of ties in with your ambient smart environments as well. Like, because we're talking about metacognition, like using technology to afford us metacognition that you could use again to proportion your attention better. Like, if you had metrics of that, like a lot of the metrics now are going the other way. But it's like, if you could measure, like, how well am I doing in my relationship? How often am I practicing wisdom? How much of my attention am I wasting on other stuff? For me, it seems like there is an opportunity there for like anti-meaning crisis technologies.
Nice.
There might be. Yeah.
We like that. We're optimists.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, because this work grew out of, it was like this ambient smart technology work is kind of reactionary against the social media stuff. I felt like I was being pessimistic for so long, and whenever I gave talks on that stuff, people were always like, "Oh, like focusing too much on the negative." And so I kind of went away, and for the next project, I thought, I just want to like really kind of be imaginative, forget about the economic incentives, the business model stuff, forget about all of that, and just think, what can we, given the picture we have of the active inference agent, what can we do what kind of technology can we imagine? And I think we can imagine some pretty amazing technology. And I think that there are no guarantees here. Obviously, there are material realities, social, political realities, but I think actually we can imagine really, really fabulous technology. And I think, like, as we continue to do work on this, I think the aim, at least for me, is to begin to maybe carefully uncover, like an archaeologist, some like principles, so that we can develop maybe a principled approach to developing good technology.
This this might actually be a good place to just jump into that a little bit, Ben. We have Ben and I have a new paper out on ambient smart tech. The first thing to say about it is it's different than the technology we've been talking about so far, because you would own this. This wouldn't be a vicious AI owned by a corporation bending you towards, their profit margin. This would be an AI that you own. I don't know if people at home know what an ambient smart environment is, but this is Ben's forte. So I think that'd be kind of cool. Ben, why don't we lay out a little bit of what we think here? Why?
Because I really think it is the opposite of the social media nightmare.
Yeah,
so,
exactly. Using AI for good.
I'm glad you said that, because that is kind of explicitly what it was supposed to be in terms of like the work I was doing. It really was supposed to be just like a counterbalance to some of the previous work I'd done. And so I mean, an ambient smart environment is it's an environment that you can work backwards. So it's a classroom or a home or an office, which is infused with smart technology, which is kind of, smart technology is kind of learning about us and updating itself kind of automatically. The ambient part is what I think is really interesting. I think that's where the magic lies. Ambient technology is just technology that functions without a kind of direct human machine, without an intentional moment of interaction or an interface. So a really easy example to get this is most of us who drive cars now use ambient technology, where we have a key fob in our pocket and it just unlocks the car when we walk over to the car. So you no longer have to press a button or put a key into the lock. Automatic doors, I think, are an example of ambient technology. They just have a sensor and they kind of open the doors when you walk in. So there are already kind of examples of ambient technology. Kind of, I mean, this is it should be said, I didn't invent this kind of vision for technology. I think that there was an essay all the way back in about 1991 by Mark Weiser on kind of Internet of Things, invisible technology. I forget the precise phrase that Weiser uses, but essentially like computing power that's operating in the background and adapting in real time to a person's needs. And so that's when we talk about ambient smart environments, that's basically what we're talking about. And most of the examples that we use in the papers are quite speculative examples. So I refer to this all the time as near future technology, because there's nothing here that is kind of that we couldn't build in principle. It's just a question of like taking the time for this to be adopted and picked up. There's already examples of like medical research, for example, into like care assisted living homes for people with dementia that are making use of like very highly networked systems of ambient technology. So I think it's just a matter of time, and I think that once you start thinking about it, you can get really, really imaginative with this. So I don't know how long you want me to carry on with this for, but like we've been thinking about the ways that like so something that's really there are very obvious applications of this. So one example is that already exists is a smart refrigerator, right? So you could have a refrigerator that you kind of tell it that you want to get better at cooking, and it starts monitoring the kinds of things that you cook. It's linked up to your oven. It's hooked up to your kind of your grocery store account, and it's kind of learning the kinds of things you tend to cook. It's maybe even using ambient sensors in the environment to watch how you cook. And then you tell it that you want to improve at a steady rate. And so it starts to just kind of turn up the uncertainty and kind of bring in ingredients that it knows that you might be unfamiliar with. And I think the thing here that's really important to recognize, and this is a key feature of a key claim in the paper that we just published, is I think up until now with traditional technology, we tend to think of technology as simplifying a problem space. So technology is there to make life easier in some way for us. I think when we think about ambient smart environments, I think one thing that is like very striking is that when we think in terms of kind of attractor states and uncertainty gradients and how that connects to affectivity and well-being in the work that Mark's done, the biggest potential here is actually to have environments that can turn up the uncertainty.
Yeah, they make it harder for you.
Environments, technology that is not necessarily trying to make you reduce uncertainty immediately faster. And so in the paper, we talk about shifting us towards exploratory action policies, shifting us towards epistemic affordances and epistemic actions, technology that is driving you to learn and to learn new embodied skills. And this has there's another paper with Inez Hipólito where we talk about the potential for like genuinely therapeutic application, because in psychiatric research there is work where psychopathology is described through the language of complex systems, where, say, like an instance of psychopathology is a kind of attractor basin characterized by certain symptoms. And the goal of psychotherapy and psychiatry is to disrupt those attractors. And so what you want to do is kind of turn the heat up, turn up the uncertainty, disrupt habitual patterns of behavior. So that's like a key distinction. And then once you have that on the table, the refrigerator example, and there's lots of different examples you can think of that are fairly straightforward, but you can get really weird with this. So there's neuroscience research that shows, for example, the frequency of rhythm, like particular frequencies in lighting and visual cues can actually entrain breathing patterns. So there's research that shows you can influence how quickly people walk through airports by modulating the frequency of particular visual cues in the environment. And so you can imagine now kind of furniture that detects, it's hooked up to a Fitbit or something, it detects when you're stressed and anxious, and it just introduces some haptic rhythm into your chair or your sofa that entrains like a different breathing pattern. There's research that shows that improved interoceptive accuracy can reduce symptoms of psychopathology. So what about a room that can now essentially, in kind of more or less subtle ways, put you inside your own body and kind of put you more in touch with your own heart rhythms and other interoceptive processes to decrease the uncertainty between brain and body. So that's what I've been doing recently. Is a lot of my time is spent just kind of fantasizing about increasingly weird ways that you can operationalize this feedback loop between the environment and the agent. And so yeah, to circle back, I think ambient technology has this huge potential for, I've been speaking to somebody recently who has a company that builds technology for elder care settings, for like care homes, people with dementia and people who care for people with dementia. A lot of the technology around dementia care is focused on like the cognitive problem. It's like, the very obvious symptoms, people like with memory issues and problems communicating. But one thing anybody who has been confronted with dementia will know is that there's a serious affective side to this as well. Mm-hmm. There's a profoundly difficult emotional side to dementia, where they experience a lot of anxiety, a lot of frustration, and they have problems communicating that. And it's very easy to think of the way that ambient technology and network devices could help alleviate those problems in various ways. So I'm really excited about this. This is pretty much all I'm working on right now, and I think that the active inference framework and the connection between affectivity and uncertainty is really useful. And the ways that technologically infused environments could kind of tap into that and pick up some of like the predictive slack and really help you. We talked about fastness and slowness before, and trying to cultivate a particular topography of attractor states that is conducive to that flexibility that characterizes well-being. It's really easy to imagine the ways that ambient environments could really support agents in doing that, to break up problematic habits or to introduce flexibility like in strategic ways. So yeah, this is what I'm working on now, and I think,
good, man. It's really exciting. I've read the paper, but I'm looking forward to reading more. In terms of that, just seems to me like the positive vision for a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Like that's the way it could go if people that actually gave a shit about other people were running it. And I think that sometimes like Like the next stage, because a lot of this stuff, once it's developed, it's cheaper, it's easier to use. Like it does become more common parlance. So, yeah, I don't think it's an actually unrealistic vision to think that you could apply those things at some point once it's made. I don't know, Mark, Sarah, I know you have to run now in a second, but yeah, is there anything you want to add to that about the ambient smart environments?
No, it's awesome.
Meaning crisis, maybe.
I mean, the only thing, no, I'm not sure, but I'm just struck by how cool I think it would be if I had a AI assistant, personally owned AI assistant, who scheduled my meetings to end a little bit early on Tuesday and proposed an ingredient I've never used that needs to be cooked with a technology I haven't used yet, like a new kind of using a knife, or like, use an air fryer in a way that I've never used before. And then it suggests that, as a possible menu approach. So I'm given a little bit more time because the ambient smart tech knows I'm going to need more time to work this out. I just think that's so cool. Like, I think it's such a cool thing to have a digital assistant.
I thought about with social media as well. I mean, if you could optimize your own algorithm, you'd probably want it to optimally challenge you rather than just keeping you in these feedback loops.
Ideally, you'd want to have a balanced news source. I don't want anything where I'm just seeing inside a filter bubble. I want to be able to see from different perspectives so that I, as the thinker, have the resources I need to think well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a really important thing to mention as well is that I haven't already, is that it's talking about carefully uncovering principles that I think would apply to good technology. I think one that characterizes ambient smart technology is, in general, it doesn't show up as an affordance in the environment itself. Mm-hmm. So this is one thing we argue in the paper. It's kind of obvious in hindsight, but it's nice to have it kind of down explicitly. Is the thing about social media, and when we think about hyper stimulators and things, is that what's really key there is the affordances that they offer to the agent. And in technology theory, generally, we tend to think of like, we think in terms of affordances, like what does this technology afford to the agent? I think what's really striking about ambient smart environments is that they don't afford anything themselves. So it's the same technology as before. So it's refrigerators and cookers and exercise bikes and all of this, but it's what's happening there. It's happening on a higher level. It's happening upstream of the agent's field of affordances. It's like this kind of like cultivating, overseeing, orchestrating role that's being played, which I think still needs to be properly theorized. So I think that's there's going to be some future work on what exactly is the best way to understand that role. But having a technology that is comfortable to fade away into the background, that's not trying to like keep your attention on it at all costs, and is playing like a fundamentally very different role.
Yeah, rather nudging your attention to other cares and concerns rather than back to it. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Less selfish technology.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. I almost hear a company name in that,
Generous tech or something.
Selfless tech. Is that what you just said?
Yeah.
Yeah, I said generous, but
definitely. Yeah, that's better. Maybe even just take out the negative inclination. Cool.
Yeah, very exciting. I'd love to talk to you again about all this, to be honest, because these are such great topics, and you're both so insightful. So thank you so much for making time.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it.